Today we're going to be doing some musical Mythbusters. So we're going to unravel some of the biggest myths in music and reveal some surprising truths that will change the way you think about music forever. At least that's my hope. Today's episode promises to be especially eye-opening. We're tackling 3 myths that have shaped how people approach music. These are myths that might be holding you back, whether you're a budding composer, a seasoned musician, or just someone curious about the art form. If you've ever wondered whether talent is something you're born with, whether music theory is the enemy of creativity, or whether classical music is just for the elite, this episode is for you. And stick around because I've got a surprising challenge and some interesting musical facts at the end that you won't want to miss. I'll also, as always, since this is mostly non-scripted, I could introduce some additional facts along the way. So let's go ahead and dive in. Let's start out with music theory. So, does music theory kill creativity? This, I believe, is a myth that has sparked countless debates. The truth, the way I see it, is music theory doesn't kill your creativity, but it expands your capability to compose creatively. So I think it does the opposite. But I don't mean that you're going to sit down and use an established chord progression or analyze your music and change everything in order to fit some theory that you've recently learned or something that you've learned in tonal, atonal, 20th century harmony, whatever you've been studying. I don't think you use these techniques to be a composer, but I do think you study them as exercises. It's just like when you practice scales on an instrument. I don't think many people would argue that practicing scales, arpeggios, chords, and all these techniques that we do. If you're a brass player, you practice tonguing techniques. We do all these things not because they're musical, but because they make it easier for us to perform. It's the same thing with being a composer. The more music theory you learn, the more adept you become at expressing your ideas. And it's not that I sit down and I play my euphonium and I think about every single note I'm pressing, the keys and the lips and everything. I'm not thinking about that. It's happening mostly automatic. Music theory, when you practice it properly, so when you audiate it, when you kind of sit there and you hear how the seventh and a dominant seventh chord resolves against the leading tone, and you hear it in these paradigms, and you're audiating. Audiating is that ability to hear things internally. When you're doing this over and over again, and you're really making these techniques part of your, I'm not even going to say subconscious, but less conscious mind, the sort of automatic portion of the mind, then what happens is when you're composing, you're just more fluid. So the more music theory you learn, the better you get at expressing your ideas. And I've seen this countless times. On the other hand, those that don't know music theory, I've come across a few people who have created really effective melodies, really interesting, beautiful melodies, but there's something lacking about their music. It just kind of flows, it kind of meanders, but you can tell there's a lot of talent there. And had they studied something formally, they would be more effective composers because you can tell they have incredible talent. I generally say that the hardest thing to teach, I'm not going to say it's impossible, but the hardest thing to teach in music is the ability to identify a melody. So, identifying melodies, creating melodies is really what I'm talking about here. They are very difficult if you don't know how to do it. It's the hardest thing to train. But I've even seen situations, and I've been teaching composition for a long time, I've seen situations where a student comes in and has a really good grasp of chord structure and how to create nice, pleasing chord progressions. Whether they know theory or not is beside the point. They have this ability to create these chord progressions, but they don't know how to create melodies. And through things like studying counterpoint, studying form and analysis, they start to get better at it. And so then their melodic ability starts to match their harmonic ability. So you can learn to write better melodies, but going back to this concept of music theory, you just have to practice it in the right way. And that's something that I've been really interested and focused on for many years because I discovered early on when I was in college, my undergraduate program, I think I was probably a sophomore, and I was taking lessons from Virko Bali. And I came across a book because of him, because I think we were studying Arnold Schoenberg, one of his pieces, and he was asking us to try and figure out what was going on in the music during a seminar. And nobody could really figure it out. We actually left the seminar, came back the next week, and he addressed the issue again. And so I realized, okay, nobody's figuring this out, so I want to go figure it out. And so I got Schoenberg's Theory of Harmony book, and I started studying it. And one of the things that he has you do is he has you write chord progressions in every key. And so he does it in a very interesting way because you don't just write chord progressions. He tells you voice leading principles that you should follow when writing the chord progressions. One of the things which I don't think he emphasizes is to listen to the chord progressions internally. And I think what happens is when you take music theory and you listen to it internally, that's when it becomes really powerful. That's when it starts to actually make you more creative. So there is an exercise that a lot of composition instructors will give their students. And what it is you'll come in and they'll say, okay, you have 5 notes. You can pick any 5 notes you want. And you have 3 rhythms. And they'll tell you what the rhythms are. And then they'll tell you to compose the best piece you can within those limitations. And so then you have to go and be really creative because you only have 5 notes. Some of them will even restrict it so you can't even go outside of the octave. You just get 5 notes and just a few rhythms. And the goal of this is to teach you how to write with restrictions. So music theory is sort of the ultimate restriction. And so I think that composers who create music theory exercises, not just something from a music theory textbook. I think when you can go and actually create these exercises where you're saying, okay, I'm going to follow these voice leading rules. I'm going to avoid parallel fifths, parallel octaves. I'm going to audiate it first, and then I'm going to try to figure out what I'm hearing on the piano and then commit it to paper. I think when you approach it that way, music theory becomes a very powerful tool for honing your skills, refining your ear, and helping you to compose more effectively. So that exercise, the restricted note composition, which is what I used for a long time in the 90s and early 2000s when I had some of my early composition students, was a really effective exercise, but the students also tend to not really enjoy it at first until you can convince them of what the benefit is by doing it. So this idea of restriction and using rules to compose, I mean, you are not lawless when you're composing. So if you're using music theory to compose, what you're doing is you're using the materials that the masters of the past have already developed and refined. And it's only the theories of sort of the most successful composers, I'm saying that kind of in quotes for successful, because we determine the most successful composers by the people that we write about and the people that we choose. And in the early days, it was really German theorists choosing German composers. Now, that's an oversimplification, but we tend to kind of, choose those that match our beliefs. And so music theory is somewhat biased because of that. And I think we all know this. But what's interesting about tonal theory is it's really, in my opinion, the theory of overtones and what creates resonance. And it's also used worldwide. So if you want to become a really effective composer and you're writing Indian music, then Western music theory can still help. But what you have to recognize is that Western music theory is not and should not be compared or used as sort of a benchmark for what Indian music should do. That's where we get in trouble. And that's where we get these programs that teach music theory, and we're trying to expand past Western music theory, which is intensive in itself, to include other theories. And we tend to do it in a very superficial way, where we'll introduce something simple, a Middle Eastern scale that's used, and then we'll compare it to a Western scale. But the problem with the way we do this is we compare it with this sort of bias, and not everybody does this, but there's sort of a bias that the Western scale is a superior one, and that we are comparing the differences. So anytime you're comparing differences and you have one core set of materials you're teaching, whether you say it or not, there's sort of this implicit idea that the subject matter of the course is somehow superior. So it's very hard to get away from that. And we teach music theory in schools, and we teach Western music theory in schools largely because the majority of students going to Western schools are going to play in Western ensembles, but that's starting to change. So what music theory do you use? I personally think you have to do a little bit of self-reflection and decide the style of music that you are most interested in, and that's the theory you should study. And you should master it. And you should do it, you should internalize it. So what I'm getting at here is it doesn't really matter what theory you end up going with, what culture's theories of music you want to absorb. The way to absorb them and the way to not kill creativity is to not take these rules, whatever the theory is, as sort of a law of composition, because they're not. They're simply sort of mirrors of what we've done in the past. They showcase what the most successful composers of that particular style did. And it takes a composer out of it. It takes the unique motivic developments that they may have done, or their melodies, or the way that they wrote. It takes them out of the picture, and it focuses on the techniques that they used. And so you're taking the music out of it. So the only way to prevent that from killing your creativity is to not become overly concerned with replicating in your compositions. I get this all the time. I get students who come in and they bring me a composition and they'll say, well, but all these chords are perfectly standard chords. They're orchestrated correctly and they follow a proper chord progression. But they don't fit the melody. Because what often happens, and this is the strangest thing, is, and I think it's because melody can be more intuitive than harmony, but they'll create these melodies that are typically pretty unique. Some of them are a little bit derivative, but a lot of times you'll get a voice that you can hear in that melody. It sounds like that particular composer, that particular student. But then the harmonies that they try and make fit with that melody are the harmonies of Beethoven, or Wagner, or Schoenberg. And it doesn't work, because what's happened here is they have used music theory, and it did kill their creativity, because they thought, well, the melody I can come up with, the melody I can intuit, it comes from who knows where. But the harmony, now that's harder. It's harder to hear harmony. And so they manufacture harmony. This is something I talk about a lot, how people manufacture music. AI is manufacturing music. It's not, I would argue, not creative. It may be interesting to listen to, and it can be kind of fun because they'll instantly create a song for you based on whatever you say, but it's not creating music. It's manufacturing music based on what already exists. And so that's what a lot of composers do. They create this great melody and then create harmony that does not fit the melody, because they don't know how to look at their melody and they don't know how to hear harmony. They can hear a melody. They can't hear harmony. So when you practice music theory, whatever music theory corner of the world you come from, what you really have to do is internalize it. You have to study that theory in its stripped form, where it's like a major scale. We don't play major scales typically in music. We don't think they're great melodies, although they could be. But we typically have more interesting melodies with skips and leaps and high points and things like that. We don't use a major scale, but you can internalize it and it can help you play better. So by learning music theory and internalizing it, it can make you compose better. And when you start to develop your ability to audiate, then you can naturally hear the progressions and the other lines that do fit your melody. And that, in my opinion, is the only way to compose. But it's the first step too, because at first you just want to get everything down on the paper. And I think that if you over focus on whether or not these notes are the right notes or whether or not your melody is good enough, you'll never finish the piece. So I think it's important to be able to sit down and just kind of brainstorm the piece until it's finished, maybe even get a voice recorder and sing the melody, because we can't sing harmony. Or if you can improvise, go to the piano and improvise the piece, because once you have it down on paper, that's when the real composition begins. That's when you start to add internal lines and internal patterns. And you don't just do patterns for the sake of patterns, there has to be a reason for them. So, do I think music theory kills creativity? It can. If you're using music theory to compose, yeah, just let AI do it, you know? But if you're using music theory to develop your skill, develop your internal listening process so that you can create more interesting harmonies to fit your melodies, then all of a sudden I think music theory not only doesn't kill creativity, it makes it that much more effective. I mean, take Stravinsky and Debussy. Debussy believed that all of his ideas were original and he didn't use music theory. Now, I understand that because Debussy is a much better composer than I am, but my junior recital in college, maybe it was my senior recital, either one, anytime I wrote something in college, I never thought about the chords I was using, not once. I listened to how the voices were moving within the chords, and I would listen to the internal line and say, where does that want to go next? And then I'd listen to the fifth of the chord, we'll just say that, and see where does that want to go and how does it relate to the melody. And so I would always just kind of intuit the entire composition. But what ended up happening was, while that was a very creative way of doing it, and I to this day can't tell you any of the chords I use in any of my early compositions, it wasn't enough. Because had I studied music theory in the way that I'm kind of advocating for now, then I think it would have been an even better recital. But you take Stravinsky and Debussy. Stravinsky was writing new music, writing some really incredible music, but he didn't really want to go the atonal route. He wanted to stick to music that was more along this tonal development route. And Debussy was also trying to create something new. There were a lot of composers at that time just kind of fighting for the next thing. And we end up having a bit of fracture. And I'd say we've never come back to one standard style, and I don't think we ever will again. But they were both masters of theory. I mean, Beethoven and Mozart meticulously went through counterpoint solutions and really understood not just how to do it, but why counterpoint worked. So that's a really important concept. And that's why I've created this series of courses where you go from ear training to audiation to counterpoint to form. Because in audiation, you learn to hear internally. That sets you up for counterpoint, where now you can compose contrapuntal lines and internalize what you're doing. Counterpoint then takes you into form and analysis, where you're actually composing works with logical structures, and then eventually you learn to create your own. So even today, learning a new concept in theory, it can really feel like unlocking a door to fresh and new ideas. And I think it's important, especially if you're dealing with writer's block, to kind of have that theory, counterpoint, form and analysis background because it can help you move past that. Okay, so we've got another myth, this idea that classical music is just for the elite. Now, I can understand where that's coming from, and I even see it propagated, but with professors that I've worked with, I mean, they just as much enjoy popular music as they do the classical music that they often perform in a lot of cases. But it's just, they're very different styles of music. One, I don't think we listen to classical music to have a party necessarily, or when driving in the car. And part of that is because classical music has these really extreme highs and lows when it comes to dynamics. It gets really loud and really quiet. With popular music, generally the volume's pretty consistent throughout the entire song. And so you can listen in a noisy car and the volume remains consistent. And so it's easier to digest in a car. If you ever try to listen to classical music in a car, you know that you're kind of going to have to sit there and constantly change the volume when it gets too quiet. And so it's not really well suited for car trips. So, I mean, they're very different styles of music. With classical music, you take a basic motive and it slowly evolves. And so you kind of have to sit there, and it's almost like a meditation where you're trying to listen for how these characters interact with each other and evolve. With popular music, it tends to be that we have simpler themes. The rhythmic structures, they tend to repeat themselves quite a bit. The chords that are used, there tend to be 3 or 4 chords per piece, and that's not all popular music, but that tends to be how a lot of them are. And it tends to be more about the message, the lyrics, and the mood. So classical music may go through many different moods in a single piece. Popular music tends to focus on one mood. Like, you don't generally have a popular music piece that starts out sad, then gets really happy, and then gets a little bit depressed, and then gets euphoric, and then kind of accepts its fate at the end, right? But classical music can do that. And part of it has to do with the forces. And what I mean is the number of players involved. So with classical music, you can command large orchestral forces. You can have several different instruments. So you can keep playing these same motives in different ways. And when you give them to the oboe versus the tuba, that same motive is going to take on a different texture. So I do think that classical music offers the opportunity for more development. But that's not to say that popular music can't do it. It's just that now you'd have to go past that sort of perfect song length of 3 to 5 minutes, and you start maybe messing around with synthesizer sounds and using other instruments, and it starts to get more complicated. So I think you could do that with popular music, but you, without really developing an idea the way that we do in classical music, I think you can only, you know, promote that idea for so long. There's a piece I wrote recently called The Hornet's Nest, and it's short. I think it's 3 to 5 minutes long, depending on how it's played. It's very short, and so if you listen to it, I'm going to actually play it for you, it has a very simple melody. And it repeats a lot. It's more like a pop song. It's actually using a modified sonata form, which is kind of funny, but it's a 3 to 4 minute sonata that just keeps reiterating this melody over and over again. And the effect of it is that if you walk away, whether you like it or not, you're probably going to remember the melody. And that's something I want you to pay attention to as you listen to this piece. Just bear with me for a moment and just humor me. And listen to this piece that I'm about to play for you from beginning to end, and then take a moment and decide if that is a melody that you could remember or not. Now, it's not a classical piece in the sense that we have all these different moods and all this development, but it still does have different sections that definitely sound different. There's a first theme and a second theme. There's a development where the horns start kind of going crazy, and then a recapitulation. in the tonic key. And so it truly is a very simple work, but it follows a classical form. Whereas a lot of music follows sort of an ABA form. There's refrains, there's very particular forms that popular music will follow as well. So I want you to listen to this and just see if that melody is easily definable. And realize as you're listening to it that it kind of goes just as long as it can before it starts to get boring. So with popular music, because you're using such simple ideas, you can't develop them too much. You don't want to develop them too much, because if you do, you end up with a really long piece, and that's not the point of popular music. It's to kind of have a particular mood, to express a particular message, a few thoughts about an idea, and if, back in the old days, and they still do this sometimes, an entire album that actually tells a story, like Pink Floyd or something like that. So my suggestion is that the problem isn't really the music, it's the perception of the music. Classical music, I think, has been marketed in a way that makes it seem very exclusive when it's really not. They've done, I mean, I've heard where they've done these tests where they bring in people that, really like punk rock, and they tend to like opera because it's dramatic. So if you're new to classical music, maybe start with something familiar, like a movie score, and just kind of let it guide you. Listen to the harmonies, and then go on to something like maybe Mahler, because Mahler will sound a lot like a film score to a lot of you, I think, if you haven't heard him before. But I think classical music can be accessible, diverse, and honestly, I think it's pretty amazing. But the other aspect of it is, I think we have to develop our ears to be able to hear what's going on in a classical piece, and that can be tiring if you're constantly listening for what's going on in the music and not just enjoying it. And so that's why ear training at a high level can help you appreciate classical music more. With popular music, you don't really need to know anything about motives or melodies. You can just sit there and be taken on a ride. Classical music, I think, sometimes a little bit different because you almost have to know a little bit about the piece. You have to know what to look for, and you have to understand how the themes are intermingling. So we're going to listen to a very simple piece that I wrote, Hornet's Nest, and you'll notice right away how simple this piece actually is. Okay, so this is a fun one. Do composers still exist? I've been getting this since I was in college. When I worked at Starbucks, that was one of my jobs. And I started out working at Arby's and I worked up to Starbucks. But I would have these customers that find out that I was going to school for music composition, and they'd say, "Oh, really? People still compose music?" And I guess they don't really, at the time, didn't really view popular music as being composed. I think they thought it was somehow created. And I also think they didn't understand that people were still writing classical with a lowercase c, so not the time period, but just classical style in general. And so I think that kind of surprised some people. And then it would inevitably lead to the question of, well, do you think we're going to run out of notes? And so at some point you won't have any original music. And I actually find that pretty difficult. I don't think that you can ever run out of notes to create original ideas, because there's only 7 notes, 12 pitches, but we can use them in so many different ways that I don't know that we could ever really exhaust all the possibilities, especially if we start opening our ears to more dissonant sounds and hearing dissonance not as clashing, but as something that is just less consonant. Like here's a little example. So if I play a third, this is going to be a minor third. It's a pretty consonant interval. If I then play a second, it starts to clash a little bit more. But if I then play a minor second, it really clashes. And a lot of times in music, if we hear that minor second, when we've had a bunch of consonant intervals, we think that the performers have made a mistake. But if the entire composition was made up of major seconds, major seventh, minor sevenths, these more dissonant intervals, then the minor second still feels like the more dissonant interval, but the major seventh, which is pretty dissonant still, starts to feel a little less dissonant. And so I do think there's a perception associated with consonance and dissonance. But if we were to free that up, which I think is something that Schoenberg was trying to do, he was trying to make the dissonance more normalized. I think if we could do that, that opens us up to even more possibilities. But even without that, there are just so many rhythms and so many ways you can present an idea, and people are always going to want to express themselves, I think. So I don't believe that there will ever be a time when you can't write anything new because it already exists. So yeah, composers still exist, and this is something that I've heard over and over again. Do composers exist? And it's kind of a funny thing to me. It's like, well, I'm a composer. I'm in a composition program, and so there's other people like me out there. I think the big question for a lot of people, though, is what do composers do to make a living? And I think it's actually, even though it may seem harder to make it as a composer, especially when you have things like streaming media, where if somebody listens to a piece of yours, you'll get paid like 0.0001 penny, 1 cent, not even, it's a fraction of a penny for each stream. Whereas in the past, albums were marketed as whole albums, and so you pay maybe 16 bucks for an album, but you had to pay the $16 and you got all the songs on it. It was easier to market when when you knew that people were going to buy an entire album. Now, when people are buying a song for $1, it makes it harder to be able to advertise that individual song. And so I think that when it comes to actually selling music, there's not a huge market for that. I think that, well, I mean, if you get millions of streams, you can start making some pretty decent money, but it really takes a lot to make any money from recordings. And on one hand, recordings are more accessible. So, I mean, here I am recording something that I couldn't have recorded 20 years ago, but recordings are more accessible. But that also means that the barrier for entry is lower. And so that's a good thing, but that means the competition is higher. So how do you cut through the noise? And I'm going to get off topic here a little bit because I want to talk about that. How do you cut through the noise? It's not going to be your music. You know, I played you a piece of mine, but I don't expect to get even a single fan. I might actually even annoy some people that I just played my music. But if you want to be a composer, it's going to be more about your message and who you are. So, in a sense, the composer becomes the product, and then the music is something that people will listen to get deeper insights into the person. So, I think if you want to market yourself as a composer, one, I do think you need to have those albums out there. I do think you still need to record. Just don't expect to make a lot of money from it. What you need to focus on is selling the sheet music and getting people to want to play your music, because the money is mostly in performances now. And I have heard that for popular music and tours and things like that, things are getting more expensive and it's harder to even make money from touring, which used to be, for the last decade at least, a really great way to make money, even if you weren't selling your CDs. And the venues are getting more expensive, and there's multiple payments you have to make just to play a single concert. So that kind of thing is starting to happen. But if you want to be a composer, I really think you have to start your own group, and whatever style of music you're doing, whether if you're a guitarist, then maybe you could do it on your own. If you're someone like me, like a euphonium player, maybe you're going to need to put together a tuba quartet or a brass band. Whatever it is, you need to try and find like-minded musicians, put concerts on. And you may have to do it just for kind of the recognition at first and try and make money off selling original compositions, the sheet music, or the rights to play a piece. There is money in sheet music and performances. So there's really two ways that you can think about this. On the one hand, you can just sell a score to somebody for whatever price you set, 20 bucks, 100 bucks or more, right? But then if they want to perform it, then they have to pay you performance rights. So it can be complicated, but there are ways to still make money as a composer, but you're going to have to work on your identity and you're going to have to find a way to cut through the noise in a way that doesn't disrespect your music, because you don't want to just be a caricature that just to get your music performed. So, I mean, that's one of the reasons why I'm not a composer, because I never wanted to have to shamelessly self-promote. And honestly, the Hornet's Nest was not me trying to promote myself. It was, I honestly wanted to show you something that I have the rights to so that I don't have to, do the monetization thing to someone else. And so that I could post this anywhere I wanted to, because this is a podcast. This is going everywhere. So if I were to play any other piece, I'd have to work out potentially some complicated arrangement that pays them every time it's played. So I'm giving you a piece that I wrote because it's a simple piece, and it illustrates exactly what I'm trying to express right now. So yeah, composers still exist. I just think that the way that composers make money is often not from the recordings, but from the sales that come after it, the sheet music, the performances, writing about music, talking about music. So I think we're in a time where you have to share more about yourself and what you're doing so that other people can learn about you, because otherwise you've got to have a reason to listen to you. With everything that's out there, how do you make them listen to you? And this is something that I work with my composers on. We meet once a month to talk about business strategies and things that they can do, like their websites and getting their music recorded, getting their music distributed, things like this. So it's really kind of a high-end thing, and it's not something where you can give general recommendations for. But if I were pressed to give general recommendations, composers still exist, and if you want to be one of those that exist, you need to promote yourself, and you need to realize you are the product. It's not so much your music. Your music generally gets recognized after people like you, so that tends to be how it works. You're not going to make a lot of money off streaming music unless you're getting millions of streams, in which case maybe you should be telling me what I should do. So, you gotta get the music out there because people need to be able to hear it. But the goal is maybe to sell the sheet music because that's where the money is, and then to try and get performances. So those are kind of the things that I'd recommend on a very basic level. And then, of course, a website's important, but it's not everything, because still word of mouth is going to be a highly effective way to get your music out. And a website, you just want to have a space on the internet that never changes. But don't think that you put all this time and money into a website, it's going to magically start selling for you, because it doesn't work that way. But it's important. It's still one of those necessary things, just like the streaming audio is a necessary thing. You have to have your music out there. Otherwise, people don't know what you're about. And you have to find ways to advertise your music to get people to listen. And I recommend against gimmicks. Like, don't tell them, you know, just clickbait type titles. I don't think that's good for your music, because it lessens, I think, what you're trying to do with the music. So I'm going to put the Hornet's Nest at the end of this, I've decided, because I don't want people to be forced to listen to it. And I'm going to put it at the end so that way you can just turn it off if you want to. And for those of you that do make it, just pay attention to the simplicity. It's a very simple piece, but does it stick in your ear? That's the important thing. And then the question you should be asking yourself is, why does it stick in your ear? So it was an experiment for me. And I'm really curious what you think. I want to know when I play this if this sticks in your ear. I'm going to talk more about that. So let's talk a little bit about some fun facts here. So we're going to keep talking about some fun facts and maybe keep things a little bit more lively here. You know that Tchaikovsky, for example, he wasn't very fond of his Nutcracker suite. He didn't really like it. And it's so funny because it's kind of like YouTube videos. You put out a YouTube video and you might hate it, but it's the one that goes viral. It's the one that everybody loves. And you're just like, okay, why? And the general advice is like when you put something up, just don't take it down because you never know what's going to be the thing that draws in your audience. And in Tchaikovsky's case, it was a Nutcracker suite. So he didn't really like it, but we play it every year. It's a really successful piece. Or, Beethoven's Ninth. This is not because he didn't like it. I mean, I think he did enjoy that piece, but it's carried by the Voyager spacecraft and it's going through space. Now, I'm sitting here thinking, I don't know if we should be telling the aliens that we're here, but it's kind of an interesting thing that when they decide to put things on the spacecraft, Beethoven Symphony Number 9 was one of the things they chose. And if you thought it was hard to go to iTunes to download something, Bach walked 250 miles once just to hear a performance. So, I mean, we look at our schedules and we're very busy and we can't find time and we don't make time for things that maybe we should. But that's just kind of a reminder that people used to go to extreme lengths to hear music, and now we have it everywhere, and we don't have the same kind of commitment, a lot of us. So I did this because what I want to do is have you send me a crazy musical fact. It could even be something about yourself. I don't mind promoting people if it's interesting, right? And so I'll feature the best ones in one of my upcoming episode. So you can either go to my website at UreMusic.com, UreMusic.com, and send me a message. You can find me on YouTube and leave a comment on this podcast. However you do it, just send me one of your craziest musical facts, and I will go ahead and talk about it in one of my upcoming episodes because I think that'd be kind of fun. I want to try and get a little bit of audience engagement here because the truth is, I sit here and I come up with 3 or 4 ideas like I did today, and then I just talk. And I talk around those ideas. Now, I'm doing this because one of the things I miss about the university is just getting up and talking. And I think it's a skill that you can lose if you don't practice it. So I pretend like I'm sitting in front of a classroom and I have to explain various topics. And so it kind of keeps me a little bit sharper. So send me your fun facts and I will feature them if I think that they're true and if they're interesting. So that's all I'm going to talk about for this episode. If you stick around a little bit, we're going to have a little performance of The Hornet's Nest. And when you listen to it, for those of you that are up to the challenge, I want you to let me know if you think the melody is memorable, not whether you like it. When it's done, do you keep hearing it? And so here's the deal on this. If you do keep hearing it, then this is why a lot of the stuff that I'm telling you works, because it's not a great piece in a lot of ways, but it's catchy. So what makes it catchy? The amount of repetition and the way that I include the repetition in the piece. So it's made up of very few ideas, but those ideas are hidden. So a lot of you won't hear them, but I think the subconscious picks them up. And it's something that I'm kind of working on right now. And I think there's something to it. I remember M. Night Shyamalan, he said that he figured out the formula for writing movies. And then the next few movies weren't that great. But I think there's techniques to writing an effective composition. And this is sort of my sample, my test piece to see if is the piece memorable? Can you remember it? So go ahead and listen to that, and then I will see you next time, and we'll talk about some more interesting things. And I hope you enjoyed the podcast today. So here's a hornet's nest. It's being performed by the Las Vegas Brass Band. Kristen Schlicker is on the E flat horn, and Tony Hussey.